Good morning. On behalf of the Portuguese Golfe Federation, we welcome you in this training session about the World Handicap System. Myself, Ana Gabin, Director of the Handicaps Department of the Federation, and Paula Coelho, Assistant of the Handicaps Department, will be presenting today. We'll run a presentation from our side, and at the end there will be opportunity for participants to ask questions through the questions icon that you see in the upper right corner of the screen, marked with a question mark. We kindly ask you to include your name and club when posting a question. Please fill in the participation form, which will also be published near the end of the session in this area to confirm your participation. Well, in this session we will cover how the project developed until the present moment and the available resources. Then, going to the contents of the rules of handicapping, we will first take an overview from a practical player's perspective, and then we will examine step by step in more detail the elements of the system that the handicap committee should understand. We will also address some more specific elements for competitions. We then return to the transition steps that will lead us into the implementation. And finally, we will answer your questions. We begin by quickly understanding the goal of the World Handicap System, which, as the name says, it is to create a single handicap system for the world, overcoming the difficulties arising from having 6 different handicap systems. Well, if there was already a single set of rules of golf, the goal is that there should also be a single set of handicapping rules. This initiative started around 2012, and in 2016 an operation committee was created to develop the project. I can add that I represented continental Europe on this committee throughout the process of setting up the system. And from that experience, I highlight the collaborative work between the different entities, as well as the respect of for all the cultural differences of how golf is played in different parts of the world, and now previous handicap systems had evolved. This project is led by the RNA and USGA, and has received the experience, knowledge, research and support from representatives of all the previous handicap systems, including the EGA. One of the cornerstones of this project is having the structure of the national federations and affiliated clubs supporting the implementation and handicapping management. Besides handicap portability between different parts of the world, what other objectives and guiding principles does the World Handicap System propose? First of all, to be a consistent and robust handicap system, which allows playing and competition in a fair and equitable basis. Also to be modern, adapted to the modern ways of living and with calculations current and updated, following more closely the evolution of the player's ability. To be inclusive and accessible to different players' profiles, attracting as many players as possible to have a handicap and using rounds from different formats. It is also flexible because, even from a global perspective, it takes into account the different golf cultures, allowing some national options. Therefore, please take in consideration that although the calculations of the handicap itself are consistent worldwide, as you encounter players from other countries, you may find some differences, for instance, in formats or procedures. What we already had with the EGA system, this concept of a system but with national options, and now we move into a worldwide scale. And of course, to the members of the Portuguese Golf Federation, the options and procedures of implementation in Portugal apply. The World Handicap System implementation started to roll out in the world in January 2020. But it is a gradual process, with different dates by country. For example, some Nordic countries started at the end of the first quarter, and Spain transited a few weeks ago. A number of European countries are aiming for November and December. In Portugal, all our preparations are moving towards to the second half of August. We'll come back to this topic at the end of the presentation when we talk about transition. As you may have seen, there are a number of resources already available through the Federation website. We invite you to share this information with your members, specifically the introduction materials with visual support such as the infographics and the FAQs. These provide a general introduction. We'll be adding more additional FAQs and communication posts over the time. The Rules of Handicapping book in its edition for Portugal becomes the reference manual for handicap committees and for consultation by competition committees and Golfe staff. This book is supplemented by the procedures on the rules of handicapping in Portugal, which follows the steps of our Appendix P, now updated in style, terminology, and relevant contexts. For now, these materials will be all digital. An important part of the preparations we are developing is at software level. And there, the priority has really been to make sure that the calculations for the World Handicap System are properly programmed according to all the specifications, technical specifications of the system. We also point out that even though the calculation method is worldwide, the database itself, which stores the playing data of the affiliated players, is national, as well as the software which we'll continue to use. In practical terms, clubs will keep using DataGolf with the current general functions and a few updates. The main new feature is a new club area, which replaces the previous central handicap system. As you can see in the picture of this new club area on the screen, with the left side menu that gives you access to the functions, namely to the players and tournaments. For players, the main tool will continue to be My FPG, where the handicap scores and scoring record page will be updated. And now I hand you over to Paula. Just a moment.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I hope you are feeling well today. Now we enter in the contents of the World Handicap System. We will start by understanding those aspects that are most relevant from the player's perspective, which can also prepare you to have simple answers to your own players' requests for information in each club. So, what do players should know about the World Handicap System? Well, especially in this first phase of transition, there may be some questions from the players about the formulas. So, one message you can convey is that, unlike in the EGA system, players are not expected to calculate their handicap. If you wish, you can transmit the general logic of the calculations as in the simple the example shown above here on the slide. Something like it's a system that uses the average of the best 8 scores out of the last 20 scores. We see the evolution in the handicap as scores come in and go out, and depending on which are the best of those scores. In addition, there are additional mechanisms in the formula, for example, to cap extreme increases and to bring down the handicap after exceptional scores. Anyway, the best thing is to go for the players to go and check their handicap in My FPG. So, what is essential is that players know their handicap. Hence the reinforcement that we have been giving with your precious cooperation for players to use My FPG where they can find their complete scoring record. Also on My FPG or in the club's website, players can check their handicap, updated handicap actually, for each day. In addition, should be any outstanding scores to be posted or any discrepancies in the handicap index, the player must inform the handicap committee or the committee in charge of the competition before playing. And yes, what players should do is to keep playing and enjoying golf, obviously. And to place scores acceptable for handicap purposes, the player should understand that he has to play by the rules of golf. What rounds are acceptable for handicap purposes? That is, rounds played under authorized formats, from competitions, from general play, in this case with pre-registration. This is very important. Both from 9-hole and 18-hole rounds, with the possibility of a minimum of 10 holes played being converted to an 18-hole round. This means that everyone can play 9 holes, everyone can submit scores from competitions and general play. The minimum number of holes to be played for an 18-hole round is 10. And by continuing acceptable rounds for handicap purposes, the player will be available to act as another player's marker and will need to have also a marker certifying the score. The player must play on rated courses using a course handicap, which is equivalent to 100% playing handicap. Also, that the purposes of a competition, there may be a playing handicap with different handicap allowance. The player needs to know the holes where handicap strokes are to be given or received. And of course, that the player is expected to make the best possible score in each hole. Also, the player must also be well aware that he should submit scores as soon as possible on the day of the play, so that the handicap is updated at the end of the day and is ready for the next day. The player should understand that the calculations include an evaluation of the playing conditions for each course and day. Also, that they should submit enough scores to provide evidence of their ability. And very important, they are also responsible for providing their home club with all necessary data on international scores or scoring records. There are a few more frequently asked questions to know about. The handicap committee monitors the handicap and can also apply additional adjustments. There are no handicap status by the number of scores. This means that there is no longer the pending handicap. There are no categories for handicap calculations. The handicaps go up to 54. The handicaps above 36 have some simplifications, namely, they can only go down. And handicaps lower than 20 have some additional checks. Well, now I will hand over to Ana for the next slides. Thank you.
Now we move on to a more advanced level of knowledge and understanding about the World Handicap System. What the Handicap Committee should know about the World Handicap System. Studying, reading the regulations is certainly recommended and welcome, but at least the Handicap Committee should become familiar with these features in order to perform their duties as an handicapping authority with delegated powers from the Federation, and to be available to clarify players who have more specific questions about their scoring record. Let's start by looking at the features that are part of the calculations. As we have been seeing, in the World Handicap System, the term representing the player's ability is the handicap index. This is equivalent of what we knew before as the exact handicap. We also see that we have a unique one calculation formula. The basis is the average of the best 8 of the last 20 scores. Here is a practical example of a player's handicap record. The last 20 scores are used, the best 8 are selected from these, which you can see marked in yellow. The average of the best 8 differential scores is calculated by adding them up and dividing by 8, making, in this example, a handicap index of 13. Sorry. This way. For each new score that comes in, the oldest 20th will come out and a new calculation is performed. The process of calculating the updated handicap index is then repeated. The best 8 score differentials are identified, added up and divided by 8. In this case, the updated handicap index is 13.3. As we can see, the score 12.1 score differential, which was previously being used for the average of the best 8, is now being replaced by a score of 14.5. As we saw in the previous example, in the scoring record, we will now have score differentials because that is what is used for handicapping calculations. We were used to talk about stable forward points. In the World Handicap System, points are less used and we'll start to hear more about gross scores. Score differentials are gross scores adjusted to the maximum number of strokes per hole, i.e. double bogey net, and taking into account factors such as the difficulty of the course and the playing conditions for the day. The score differential represents to what handicap the player played on that round. For example, if they played to 8.2, 18.5 or 42.7. Let's see a practical example. We have a player with the handicap index of 18. We consider a neutral course where he gets 18 strokes. The player has an adjusted gross score of 90 strokes. Applying the score differential formula, we see that he has played exactly to his handicap of 18.0. By the way, we also see that the 90 strokes correspond to the sum of the par with the course handicap. So it is also equivalent as doing 36 stable forward points. Now we can see what would happen on a more difficult course where the player receives 22 strokes. If the same player on this course did the same adjusted gross score of 90, then it would mean he played better than his handicap and had, in that case, a score differential of 15.1. Here, his target score was 94 strokes. Here we have an example of a scoring record as you will see it in the new club area or in my FPG. For each round, a score differential is calculated and a new handicap is produced. As you can see, there is also a function to view more data. This function opens the details of the calculations and shows which differentials were used for each handicap calculation. The best 8 are marked in red. This is the main structure of the calculations. This example is also illustrative of how the rotation of scores in and out can impact the calculations. Now let's look at other features. The World Handicap System has additional mechanisms within the calculation. With regards to handicap increases, the World Handicap System keeps memory of each player's handicap evolution and specifically of the lowest handicap index the player reaches in the 365 days preceding the most recent score already in the scoring record. Please note that this is the low handicap index and not the lowest score differential. This low handicap index provides a benchmark against which the current handicap index can be compared and starts as soon as the player has 20 scores. The comparison is used for the application of caps. This is to help ensure that the player's current handicap index does not deviate too far from his demonstrated ability in too short of a time. For example, if the player has had a temporary loss of form. On the other hand, the cap can also serve as anti-abuse mechanism and will aid in minimizing the potential of handicap manipulation. Let's see. There are two caps. The soft cap reduces or breaks the increase. The hard cap prevents or stops the handicap from rising above a certain level. If we imagine an analogy to a motorway, the normal running of the car on the track corresponds to the calculation of the average of the best 8 of the last 20 scores. This is the green light. and the calculations fluctuate freely. If the handicap reaches a difference of more than 3 strokes between the current calculated handicap and the low handicap index, the car goes to the gravel. The speed is braked, i.e. the increases above these 3 strokes are suppressed to only half the value. This is the yellow light zone. If, even after braking, the player reaches a difference of more than 5 strokes between the calculated current handicap and the low handicap index, the car hits the protective rail, stops, and the handicap does not rise more than 5 strokes. Red light. Here we have a practical example. It is a case where the soft cap is triggered and the player receives a slightly lower handicap than if he was inside the green line. The caps are perhaps the subject that require more calculations. Let's go through the example step by step. The average of the calculated score is 26.438. The low handicap index is 22.8. Hence, the difference between those two values is greater than 3, and the 3 strokes are used since they correspond to the green light zone. From the remaining, only half is used, which is added to the 3 strokes. Finally, this value is added to the low handicap index and rounded up. The general idea is that for the increases, the value within the green light, the 3 strokes, is added to half of the value within the yellow light, and that finally these values are added to the low handicap index to create the new handicap index. The important thing here is to understand that all these calculations are done automatically. And if the handicap committee or the player wants to see them, they are available on the scoring record, as you can see on the top of the screen. But if eventually you want to check them, it is possible to do so with the calculation step by step. Here we see another example that reflects the process of the hard cap. First, the yellow light is applied, and then the calculation follows the yellow light steps. If the calculated increase is more than 5 strokes above the low handicap index, the red light limits the red light limits the increase to a maximum of 5 strokes. In this case, a 5 is added to the low handicap index, and this is the player's new handicap. But as mentioned, all these calculations are all made in the software system. We have seen the general formula of the average of the 8 out of 20, and we have seen the mechanism to limit the upward movement of handicaps. Now let's see what happens if the player submits an exceptional score. In this case, the system applies an additional reduction to the player's calculated handicap according to the table. If the score differential is 7 strokes or more better than the player's handicap, then an additional 1 stroke reduction is automatically applied. If it reaches 10 or more shots better than the player's handicap, then additional reduction is of 2 strokes. We have an example of an exceptional score of a young improving player and with a difference of more than 10 strokes between the handicap and the last score. As you can see, the adjustment of -2 is applied to the last 20 scores, and the calculation of the handicap is done already with the reduced score differentials. The system also has a statistic calculation that determines whether the playing conditions on a day differ from normal playing conditions to the extent they significantly influence players' performance. It is called PCC, or playing conditions calculation. Examples of conditions that can influence the performance of players are the course conditions, the weather conditions, the course setup. This calculation is automatic and includes all scores sent to the server by each day and each course. It may range from -1 for easy conditions to +3 difficult conditions. The value is visible on the player's handicap record. Calculations of handicaps are performed at the end of the day. So all scores for that day, whether they are from competitions or general play, should be sent to the server during that day. This is so that the new handicap index is available on the following day. This also means that even if more than one score is played on a day, the player's handicap index remains the same during that day. Very good. And now I send you over and over to Paula. Just a second.
Yes. Oh, okay. Now the slide is in. Well, the next topic, the maximum handicap index. Well, the range of handicap index ranges from handicaps plus to a maximum of 54. Including caps up to 50, handicaps up to 54 speaks to one of the key principles of the WHS, of the World Handicap System. To be as inclusive, as welcoming as possible, to make it easy as possible for golfers to obtain and maintain a handicap index. There are already high handicap golfers on golf courses today. Providing new players with an initial handicap index as soon as possible can help them better track their progress and motivate them. For others, providing the handicap they truly need, it can help them keep the interest in golf and keep them playing for more years. Now, for fewer handicap calculation for fewer than 20 scores. When a player has even less than 20 rounds, he can still have a handicap. In fact, a player may have an initial handicap as from one score of 9 or 18 holes. The calculations do the applicable adaptations using a smaller proportion of scores for the average. A reductive adjustment is also automatically applied for protecting the system because there are still few scores that demonstrate the player's ability. So let's see a first example. A beginner player submits an initial score, one initial score. The score differential is 54. The proposal for handicap assignment is 52 due to adjustment of -2. Remember the table of the previous slide. A second example, a beginner submits 3 scores with calculated differentials of 36.5, 43.2, and 55.9. The player's handicap index is 34.5 due to the adjustment of -2. When the player submits a 40.7 score, the handicap index becomes 35.5. The 36.5 score is still the lowest, but the player now has an adjustment of only -2. Well, we also maintain a more simplified procedures for handicaps between 54 and 36. So these handicaps can only change automatically downwards. And I will continue from the next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Now we'll speak shortly about course rating. A handicap system must always be complemented with a method of assessing the difficulty of the course played. For that purpose, the World Handicap System also includes the former USGA course rating system. Therefore, we'll continue to use course rating, slope rating, and par values in the handicap calculations. Course rating represents the course difficulty under normal conditions for the scratch player, i.e. a player with 0 handicap. It is calculated with the lengths and elements that affect it and the factors that characterize the course difficulty, collected according to a systematic methodology. An identical process is used to calculate the bogey rating internally, which indicates the difficulty of the course for the bogey player, i.e. a handicap of about 20 for men and 24 for women. From the relationship between these two values, the slope rating is obtained. The use of par in comparison to course rating, which was already used in EGA system, makes it more intuitive for players to relate the difficulty of the course, as they can relate to par net par, or to the number of stroke play points, stable 4 points. We still have a handicap applicable to each set of tees, depending on the level of difficulty of the course. But we have now identified in the new system two names. The course handicap, which represents the number of strokes a player receives when playing a specific set of tees, as determined by the course rating, slope rating and par. And that's the same as the 100% playing handicap. The playing handicap itself is based on the course handicap, but may be subject to an allowance or limits determined by the terms of competition. Here we see an example of a handicap table, which WHS we will publish playing handicaps of 100% and for 95% handicap allowances. On the daily basis, a playing handicap of 100% is what the players will use for general play, but for competitions or formats, other allowances may apply. I hand you over again to Paula.
So now we look at the scores that may be acceptable for handicap purposes. We have seen that acceptable scores have some requirements. Let's go back to some of them. Rounds have to be played in a playing format acceptable for handicap, in a minimum number of holes, by the rules of golf, with a marker, and on a course and tees rated. Let's explore these issues just a little further. Regarding the formats we see that are acceptable as handicapping scores, competition and general play, 9 and 18 hole formats, in the previously available formats of stroke play, stable 4, par bogey, and maximum score. Regarding the 9 holes scores, they are all converted by the computer system to 18 hole score differentials. In general terms, it will be equivalent to add 17 stable 4 points for the played holes. Overthought, in specific cases, there is a slight difference. Now I'm handing over to Ana again. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Let's continue then. There are also situations when a score that is not finished and has some holes that are not being played can be converted into acceptable 18-hole score. In this case, the converted hole-by-hole score will be registered by the player or committee, since there is no automatic procedure. The values to apply will be: if a minimum of 10 to 13 holes has been played, apply par net par plus 1 additional stroke on the first hole not played, i.e. 2 stable 4 points per hole and 1 point on the first hole not played. If a minimum of 14 holes was played, apply net par for each hole not played. We also clarified that, as you may notice from reading the rules of handicapping, the system only lists rounds of 9 and 18 holes. And even if this conversion from 10 to 18 holes still includes mentions some specific conditions. But we know that recently there has been interest in, for example, 12 holes. The main reason why 12-hole rounds cannot be directly contemplated including in the system is of a technical nature of course rating. Ratings are for 18 holes or comparable with 18 holes in the case of 9-hole ratings. This is because the scores must be all compared to each other and in an 18-hole scoring record. With the procedures described above, it is possible, as a first step, to open the possibility to convert, for handicapping purposes, from 12 to 18 holes. But please note, this is always conditioned to setting up and using the structures, namely the software structures, for 18 holes. We continue to apply a maximum score per hole for handicap purpose, the double bogey net, which in practical terms is the lowest number of strokes equivalent to a 0 stable 4 points on that hole. There is also a communication effort to explain to players that they should pick up the ball when they reach this limit if the form of play allows it, hence promoting a good pace of play. With regards to the procedures for general play, i.e. which were previously referred to as extra day scores or EDSs, we'll keep the pre-registration requirement and the options for submitting scores, either digitally or through the manual process. We emphasize that you should continue to recommend to your members the use of MyFPG, namely because that way you're better able to monitor and manage the process, and with less administrative effort from the clubs and the courses. It is also thinking in the administrative effort that the clubs have in order to manage general play cards, that we will change the verification process of these scorecards, registration through MyFPG. So the cards submitted on the day by the players will become directly available for handicap calculations at the end of the day. The handicap committee will continue to have a supervisory role, and when necessary it can remove one or more scores, but this reduces the dependence on manual work. The updated handicap will then be available for the following day. Please note this will be subject to approval. Some handicaps and some situations are still subject to approval of the Handicap and Course Rating Committee of the Federation. This is the case of general play scores for handicap index below 2.0 and general play scores with the score differential lower than 2.0 when the score differential is lower than the player's handicap index. And I hand over again to Paula. Just one moment.
Thank you again. So now let's see the handicap committee specific tasks of handicapping management. This new regulation reinforces the role of the club handicap committee of each player. The handicap committee is responsible for managing the system according to the rules of handicapping, educating and communicating with the members, monitor, mediate, and promote players' compliance of the rules of handicapping, and review and adjust the handicap of its players. In the following slides, we will focus on the most operational functions, following the processes as they are available or foreseen in the new clubs area and in Data Golfe. Handicap allocation to new players can be made by the handicap committee from the moment the player has a minimum of 1 score, but may he have more scores. The player can have more scores. And if the player has adequate knowledge of the rules of golf. We see that the handicap allocation process will be in the new club area in administration section dedicated to initial handicaps. So news are coming. There you will find a list of players without handicap, but with scores. Through the editing icon, the committee checks the scores differentials and the suggestion from the system, which includes the system adjustment, scoring, records with less than 20 results. The committee may decide to change or confirm the proposal and allot the handicap. And Ana will talk about the next topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Now we'll talk about handicap adjustments by the handicap committee. So whenever necessary, the handicap committee may apply an adjustment to increase or reduce handicap in order to reflect the demonstrated ability of the player. For the adjustments, a minimum of 1 stroke is considered. Also, ratification by the Handicap and Course Rating Committee of the FPG is required for handicaps lower than 2.0 and for adjustments for more than 5 strokes. We recommend reading the procedures on the rules of handicapping in Portugal, Appendix B, on administrative and appeal procedures for these handicap adjustments. But at least you should retain the general message that the handicap committee should record the grounds for the decision, should inform the player and give him the opportunity to contribute to the process, and finally, to implement the decision in the computation system. These decisions are subject to appeal to the Handicap Incorporating Committee of the Federation, but we recommend that before submitting an appeal, the player and his handicap committee discuss the matter together. In addition to occasional adjustments, the World Handicap System also foresees a minimum of one annual review, but those details will be presented later, as we still require some more information about the technical specifications. The adjustment to the handicap is recorded in the club's area, and it also applies to the last 20 scores in the scoring record. The administrative and appeal procedures, as you mentioned, are included in the procedures for the rules of handicapping in Portugal. Let's go step by step. How is this adjustment done? The change is registered in the club's area. The handicap is immediately updated, but it also has an effect on registering an adjustment in the last 20 scores after entering a new score. Let's see an example. In the club area, the committee selects the player and applies the value of the new handicap, restarting the calculations for this value. The new handicap becomes immediately available. We also see that when the handicap is calculated again when the player submits a new score, the system will automatically apply an adjustment to the previous 20 scores, corresponding to the reduction applied by the committee. This way, the effect of the handicap adjustment is incorporated in the handicap calculation. It affects not only that moment, but will continue to affect and influence the subsequent updates. But it will also disappear as the player submits more scores. Now we talk about handicap allocation and adjustments based on foreign handicap records. This was the subject that had most requests for clarification in the registration form. So let's go and explain it step by step. If a player is a member of the Portuguese Golf Federation, even if he also has a handicap in another country, he will have a handicap index issued in Portugal through his home club in Portugal. This allows national clubs to continue to keep a close eye on the handicap of their members, but at the same time using all the evidence about the player's demonstrated ability. It is the player's responsibility to submit the record from the other country, from the other jurisdiction, to the Portuguese home club whenever he arrives or returns to the country. This was already our procedure in Portugal within the GA system. Please note that the player should bring the scoring record with the scores, not just the handicap certificate. As you can understand from this presentation, the handicap databases are still national. On the medium-long term, opportunities for greater automation may arise, but the current situation is that the updating of the handicap needs to be registered by the handicap committee. We also note here that the ratification is necessary for handicaps below 2.0 by the Handicap Incorporated Committee of the FPG. Now we can also explain to you how this simplified method of posting score based on these scoring records from another country. The input of scores based on foreign handicap records will not require all-by-all scores. We are trying to minimize the administrative work, but we also have to be aware that, in part, the way we register scores depends on the data that arrives at the club. So we are preparing several options for input by totals. The most direct one will be by score differential. Those countries that have already transitioned to WHS will be able to provide to players a scoring record which lists the score differential. This will be the easiest way. So date, time, so identification of the round and the final score differential. But on other cases, it is possible to register the scores through the minimal totals that allow us to calculate the score differential, such as with the adjusted gross score or stable for total points. And then adding the information of course rating, slope, par, and PCC. And again, this is by totals, not all by all. We are also aware that some additional flexibility may be required. For example, the Congo handicap records, until GBNI makes their transition to WHS, we will follow the same principles that we have applied before with the conversion of the available values. For example, the CSS will be equal to the course rating. If the slope value is not yet available, we can use an average value. If the total score arrives as net differentials, the clubs can easily see what it is in stable for points. As more countries implement the World Handicap System, we will hope that the process will stabilize and we can look at new developments in this matter. But for now, clubs will be able to register scores in a summarized way and apply adjustments to these players. A different situation is for visiting players who are not members of a club in Portugal and who play only in a specific competition in Portugal as a guest. We'll keep the same logics as before. If the player comes from an EGA country, he will play with his EGA handicap until that country converts to WHS. If he comes from a country where WHS is already implemented, he will play with his handicap index. If the guest player comes from the Congo system, he will apply the same conversion that we already used in EGA for guests from Congo, with the average slope being used, and which is done by data Golfe. Okay, so now let's talk about a different topic, penalty scores and adjustments. This new system follows the assumption that all acceptable scores under conditions already explained should be submitted. So all the conditions for acceptable scores, including pre-registration for general play scores, are to be submitted, provided that a minimum of holes is played. So what happens if the score is not submitted when there's a no return? There are no automatic increases of handicap for players who do not show that they are entitled to such increase, no 0.1s. In fact, the score could even lead to a reduction of handicap. If the player does not submit the score, but the score is known to the committee and there is no valid reason for a no return, then it should be posted. This can happen in a competition or it can happen later by intervention of the handicap committee, which can also add a penalty score to the player's scoring record through the club's area. The handicap committee should also consider, for cases of repeated non-submission of scores, to apply a handicap adjustment to increase or decrease the handicap index. We are planning to provide in the future list of statistics to assist the clubs in detecting players who repeatedly fail to submit scores. The World Handicap System includes the possibility that the player index may also be withdrawn. On this subject, we recommend reading in detail the procedures on the rules of handicapping, Appendix P. But in short, we can separate the issues related to withdrawing or suspending handicap in two areas. First, we have technical reasons for withdrawing a handicap. In specific, this can relate to any issues in membership status in relation to the federation or to club membership status. For example, if a player is no longer an affiliated member, he automatically ceases to have a handicap. Also, within the technical reasons, the handicap committee may temporarily suspend handicap if they have doubts as to whether rules of handicapping are being fully complied and with the objective of rectifying the handicap. The procedures are described in the Appendix P. Once these technical matters have been settled, namely because the player has rejoined the club or the federation, or the committee has corrected the handicap is valid again. On the other hand, any disciplinary suspension resulting in the suspension of handicap follows disciplinary procedures set out on the disciplinary regulations of the FPG or the club. In disciplinary matters, the handicap committee may submit a disciplinary complaint when there is evidence that a player is deliberately or repeatedly failing to comply with the responsibilities under the rules of handicapping. For example, if a player repeatedly fails to submit scores in order to gain an unfair advantage. Very good, and now I pass you over to Paula again.
Okay, so now let's look at some aspects of organizing competitions in relation to WHS, to World Handicap System. First, the cooperation is promoted between the Handicap Committee, the committee in charge of the competitions, and the golf club and golf course management in order to safeguard the correct application of the rules of handicapping. For example, in relation to golf course, there is to consider all the responsibilities related to the maintenance of the course ratings. We recommend reading the procedures on the rules of handicapping in the Appendix P for more details about this subject. In relation to members and golf development, the WHS, for example, promotes a calendar of competitions that meets the different playing skills of the players, offering all members the opportunity to submit acceptable scores for handicaps. And I believe it's Ana.
Thank you, Paula. Now continuing in terms of the competition, more specific in the area of direct action of the committee in charge of each player, some possible terms of competition should be mentioned. This is for the purpose of eligibility. It is possible to set limits to enter or use the handicap index or the playing handicap. It is possible to include terms that allow for specific adjustments to the playing handicap. It is also necessary to set on the terms of competition what happens to the handicap in competitions with several rounds. More often, the handicap index will remain unchanged for the duration of the multi-round competitions. The terms may set different prizes and results according to ranges of handicaps or players' profiles. More specific, next slide. For competitions, it will also be necessary to set the handicap allowances to be applied to the competition under the terms of the competition and then in data golf. The application of handicap allowances already existed before, but WHS brings us news about how to use it. The recommendation described by the system is based on different probabilities of winning or getting top positions if you play against one player or compete with a wider field of players. The World Handicap System is an average system. It gives us a picture of average scores of each player, which fits well with match play. Both have 50% chance of winning the match, even if the score itself is not very good. For net events with a field as from 30 players in the formats of stroke play, the new system recommends using a 95% allowance. This is to have an equal probability of being in the top 10% of the results. Here, the player has to make a very good score to be well ranked in relation to the other players. If the World Handicap System reflects the general playing averages, then for fairness in specific competition formats, the system takes into account the normal and expected dispersion variation of scores of players with different abilities and recommends the application of allowances. These percentages are recommendations from the scientific research team, but there is also some degree of flexibility. For example, to play stable forward in general play, in small groups or in closer handicap ranges, 100% is suitable and simple for players. Therefore, it is also on your side in day-to-day running of competitions to find a balance, using the recommended allowance within these levels, but at the same time without benefiting too much players with lower or higher handicaps. In any case, for handicap purpose, the course rating handicap is used, i.e. 100% of playing handicap, and the rounds of formats marked in green in the table are acceptable for handicapping. To check their playing handicap, players can use the handicap tables under the columns for 100% or 95%, and the other functions within DataGolf, such as draws and labels or online consultation, are still available. There are also recommendations for a wider range of formats that you can check. Finally, in what concerns competitions, and in relation to submission of scores in competitions, we'll still have the exceptional situation that even if a score is disqualified for competition purpose, it may be acceptable for handicapping if that score does not reflect a significant advantage. And now we enter the topic of transition. And we go back to the preparations for implementation of the World Handicap System. By transition, we mean how we're going to go from an EG handicap to a World Handicap System handicap. First of all, we inform that every affiliated player with a handicap will have a handicap system under the World Handicap System, handicap index, a new handicap index. And now, how will this be done? With the World Handicap System actual formats, but with historical records in the central database. We have the benefit of already having a central base for many years. And we'll be calculating the evolution of the scoring record since 2018, i.e., as if there was already a World Handicap System since that date. And why? This is to include in the calculations all the mechanisms of the rules of handicapping, as we saw in the slides about the formulas, including the caps, the exceptional scores, the adjustments for records with fewer than 20 scores. And we will apply this method to the scores on the Federation server, which can go up to 2010. So that as many players as possible start their record in 2018 with already 20 scores. This structure provides us with a safe and consistent transition. In addition, we have added a simple mechanism for players with a small number of scores, less than 20 or fewer than 20. Those will receive an initial virtual score equivalent to the last EGA registered on the last scorecard, because for these, the small number of scores gave us less data for the transition. On the other hand, manual adjustments are not going to be copied into the new system because they were correcting a handicap that will no longer be the player's handicap, and therefore those adjustments could create new inaccuracies. Any eventual manual adjustments will be made case by case after the transition and already with the new handicap record. We emphasize the message that since this is a new system with new formulas, it is normal that there will be new handicap values. We anticipate to release a preview of the new handicaps a few days before the entry into force of the new handicap systems under the World Handicap System. Clubs will receive access to see the club's area, and they can get acquainted with the menus. They can also analyze the list of handicaps and detect any particular case whose handicap requires more attention or an adjustment. On that preview, players will also see their scoring records, explore it, and can contact the club about any questions that they may have. We safeguard the possibility of having to spend IT services for about 2 days before the final migration, but we will do our best to reduce this time. With the official entry into force of all handicaps of the new handicap system, all systems become operational, and the new handicap is the handicap in place to be used for competitions and for all formats of play. From the current affiliated members with handicap, we've made some simulations to give us an idea of the trends that we can expect with the transition. And if we were to simulate it today, we could see that about 70% of the players is within 0 to 2 strokes of difference, up or down, when comparing the current EGA handicap to the new World Handicap System handicap index. If we look at a range of up to 5 strokes, we see that 98% of the players are within that range. We did also find about 2% of players that have variations greater than 5 strokes, up or down, and this one should be carefully analyzed by the handicap committee. Of the examples that we saw, these larger variations are actually usually justified either by lack or inconsistency of scores, or some small inaccuracies that came from the previous scorecard themselves, but they were not noticeable at the time, but with the recalculations became more obvious. That's why we count with you to check and eventually correct some cases, but it is also important to understand what are the general trends and what to expect with this transition. So let's see some more charts. If we see the type of variation from EGA to the new handicap system, we find that there is a trend for more increases, which we can understand when we consider that the World Handicap System calculations in comparison to the EGA, and we have in consideration the profiles of the majority of the players. But it's also relevant to understand the distribution of the mean variation, of the average variation by ranges of handicap and its logic. For handicaps up to 5, which we see that actually, because they are more consistent within their scores, they actually have a trend for reduction. The general trend for the remaining handicaps is to increase, explained by the way the value of the handicap index gets closer to the reality of the score differentials of the players. If in the EGA handicap system only increased by 0.1 steps, and then there were many annual review recommendations for increase, these new calculations will follow more the evolution of the average of the playing by each player. In the even higher handicaps, we find fewer scores per player, less than 20 scores, which, as we have already seen, influences the calculations and potentiates more equal or lower handicaps in the transition when comparing EGA to WHS. Well, that's enough for numbers for now. We hope that you feel better prepared for the transition for handicap management in the new system and that you can help your players at this stage. We have detected interest and motivation about this new handicap system, and we are counting with your collaboration for a successful implementation. Furthermore, we'll continue to be in contact with the handicap committees during the next months with instructions on the next steps of implementation and access to the software.